In our fourth Bible study on God's abundance, we read a text from the 20th chapter of Matthew's Gospel. And it's a challenging one. It's towards the end of Jesus' ministry, just as he prepares to go to Jerusalem for the events of Holy Week and the crucifixion. And as we get toward the end of Jesus' ministry, his message gets that much more difficult for us to accept sometimes. We are usually provided a picture of Jesus as the loving servant, as God's child, as the one who will redeem us. But then in the parables, we sometimes get difficult propositions. And the one that we are given in this story is particularly challenging. God is depicted as the owner of a vineyard. He goes to the marketplace and picks up workers for his vineyard first thing in the morning, promises them the daily wage, and they agree and go to the vineyard. God returns at midday, finds workers, they accept the proposition, they go to work in the vineyard. God returns several more times, including right at 5 o'clock. And the workers accept the vineyard owner's offer and go and work in the vineyard. At sundown, it's time for everybody to go home and get paid. The way it turns out is that everybody who came to work gets paid exactly the same amount of money. The people who worked from sun up to sundown through the midday heat get the same wage as the people who are only there for an hour. And so, of course, there's people who are upset and they ask, they want to know why are we getting paid the same amount as the people who got paid, who only worked for an hour? And God says, or the vineyard owner says, that they got the wage that he wanted to pay, and that it's really not their business to question that. And so we read this as people who work or have worked, who know what it means to put in an hour and to get paid for it, and who all too often know what it's like not to be fairly compensated for our work. We look at this story and we think, this is not fair. God, i.e. the vineyard owner, is not being fair with these workers. But God's response is, the vineyard owner is doing what is right. And so here we sat in our Bible study in this intersection between what is fair for us and what is right in God's eyes. And of course, Jesus begins this parable with the words, "The kingdom of God is like." So one of the things that we had to realize in our study is that this is saying something very powerful about the nature of God and how God uses God's infinite abundance in ways that may not seem fair to us, but that represents what God believes is right. The story reinforced how God's kingdom is so very different from the world as we know it, as we have constructed it. And so, because we approach God from our lived experience, we project a lot of our lived experience onto this God who loves us so much and so abundantly. And so we come into conflict with the image of who God depicts himself, and I apologize for the masculine pronoun, depicts himself to be. And so this led to a very rich discussion about fairness, about rightness. And we also extrapolated this into how are we meant to incorporate this into our lives as individual faithful Christians and in our lives as a faith community. What does this mean in terms of our generosity and Jesus's eternal call for us to be generous with our love and ourselves in the same way that Jesus was generous with his love and his self? An hour wasn't enough for us to come to any clear conclusions, but it provided an awful lot of food for thought. And so I invite you who may not have been able to join us for our Bible study to read this lesson in chapter 20 of Matthew's Gospel and to consider how what God believes is right, what God's kingdom looks like, what God's promises to us mean in the context of this kind of abundant generosity, and how we might incorporate that image of God into our own faith journeys individually and as a community. We continue next week with more examinations of how this abundance plays out in our faith journey. Please join us if you can, Wednesday at 7 p.m. Blessings.